All right, welcome everybody. Good evening. Thanks for coming. Get this out of the way. It's April 7th, 2016, 6 o'clock. This is the debate, science and public and personal decisions about GMOs. We've removed the and nutritional supplements from the title. In agreement. The panel number is 4952. I'm Joel Dyer. I'm the editor at Boulder Weekly. I'll be moderating tonight. After much discussion, I will be the world's most impartial moderator in the history of CWA. I really will. Anyway, I want to talk about a couple of things. This is the first time, my understanding is this is the first debate format that we've had at CWA, which is really cool. And it's really important that it goes off well. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to tell you, we have kind of an odd format. Again, I'm not going to be asking all the questions or anything like that. So I'll bring you up to speed on that. I'm going to be this unbiased moderator. I'm going to keep track of time. The rules are each of these guys is going to have an 8-minute opening statement. Conversation about one at a time about the subject. They will then have approximately 3 minutes. I say approximate. It's going to be 3 minutes unless they extend for the other person. A response to that. My guess is, having spoken to both of them by then, I'll just be sitting back here and listening along with the rest of you as they go back and forth. If for some reason silence erupts, I'll jump in. I don't think that's a problem. But speaking of silence, it may be a problem for some of you. My understanding is that we have had some issues with, applauding and hissing and booing and standing up, screaming out questions that, by the way, there is no Q&A to this in this format. They will use the entire hour, so don't stand up and yell any questions. And the reason this is really important, and one is it's really in kindness to these folks who are here to debate each other on a really important topic. And we should be learning from both of them as it goes through and listening to what they have to say. The other part is I am a terrible authority figure, and I don't want to have to say, oh, please stop and things like that. And if you guys do get too unruly, I've been told to just stop the debate, and that would make me you wouldn't like me, and I don't want to do that. So just let these guys talk, let them interact, and my goal is to be as invisible as possible, except when I'm doing this, which means it's time for them to change places. And if one of them at the end of a 3-minute segment is mid-thought, we care mostly about you guys and about the information that you'll be getting. So they can look at the other person and say, may I continue briefly, and get permission and keep going a little bit. So I'm not going to say, no, that's 3 minutes, shut up, be quiet, don't do anymore. This is their debate. I'm just the timekeeper. In a perfect world, that's what's going to happen. So without further ado, let me introduce everybody here. This is Jeffrey Smith. You can read all about him in your programs. He's a consumer advocate and author. He doesn't like GMOs that much, I think it's safe to say. Michael Klymkowsky is a professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology here at CU. He likes them more. Doesn't care about them, just cares about science. Okay, so we flipped a coin backstage, and the winner of that was, let's see, you won. You wanted to go second. So Jeffrey's going to start off with his 8 minutes first. Here we go. Please, no booing, hissing, all that stuff, because I don't want to be a cop. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
No, you're clapping. That was.
Oh, you didn't say clap. I didn't say clap. How many people here are concerned about the health dangers of genetically engineered foods? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people are actually trying to avoid eating GMOs? All right. Has anyone noticed an improvement in their health when they switch to non-GMO organic foods? I thought so. I asked that question a lot, over 150 lectures by now. Well, let me give you a little bit of background. The FDA was asked to regulate GMOs, but they were asked in an interesting way by the White House. They were asked to promote GMOs, to get them on the market quickly by the White House in the first Bush administration. And so they created a new position, the Deputy Commissioner of Policy, to oversee the policy creation on GMOs, and gave that to specifically for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. And Michael Taylor presided over that policy and then became Monsanto's vice president, and then he's now back at the FDA as the U.S. Food Czar. And while he was in charge of policy, it came out, and it said the agency is not aware of any information showing that the foods created from these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. And therefore, no safety studies were needed. No labeling was needed. Companies like Monsanto, who told us that Agent Orange, PCBs, and DDT were safe, could determine on their own if their GMOs were safe. There was no official approval of GMOs by the FDA, just a voluntary consultation process, technically known as a meaningless exercise. Now, 7 years later, the FDA was forced to reveal documents, all of its files on GMOs, because of a lawsuit. And that's when we discovered the fraud. The overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite, that GMOs were different and dangerous. You can read the memos on my website. They said GMOs could create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and needed to be studied carefully, each one, even long-term studies, even human toxicological studies. However, they were ignored, and their complaints were denied. Years later, in 2009, a medical organization evaluated the animal feeding studies on GMOs, and the AEM came up with a policy statement saying these animals who ate GMOs in the lab studies suffered from gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, etc. And it was clear evidence that GMOs were at fault, and therefore all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets while they're still on the shelves. In fact, they asked the government to remove them from the shelves. Since then, more animal feeding studies have shown multiple massive tumors, hormonal disruption, early death, etc. Now, thousands of doctors are prescribing non-GMO diets to their patients. Do we have any practitioners here, doctors or practitioners prescribing non-GMO diets? Okay. So I get the chance to speak at medical conferences and tell the doctors about the dangers of GMOs, but I also ask from them, both from the podium and also individually, what have you noticed? Do you notice any changes? And it's interesting that the improvements in their patients, according to the doctors, fall into the same type of categories as the problems that were afflicting the lab animals that were fed GMOs. Then I spoke to the farmers who changed their pigs and cows from a GMO-fed diet to a non-GMO-fed diet, and they recovered from the same diseases and disorders. Then we look at the actual incidence of those diseases and disorders, and they happen to be rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup, which is sprayed on most GMOs. Of course, correlation does not prove that there is a cause and effect, but it's part of the bigger story. So you have lab animals, human experience, livestock experience, pet experience, and you have epidemiological evidence to support but not prove a link. But then you have what is a GMO and how is it possible that a genetically modified organism could create this or any disease? There are three things that I'd like to focus on tonight as causes or potential causes for disorders. One is the process of genetic engineering itself, which causes massive collateral damage to the DNA and can create, just as the FDA scientists said, allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. Then there are corn varieties and cotton that produce their own toxic insecticide called Bt toxin that pokes holes in the walls of the insects to kill them. So another point that I want to mention tonight during the debate is why many of us believe that Bt toxin, as produced in these crops, is dangerous to humans and could account for some of these diseases and disorders. And then the third is that Roundup herbicide is the reason why most GMOs are there. Monsanto's patent on Roundup was expiring. They created Roundup-ready crops to be sprayed with Roundup, and they maintained a dominant position, selling what's now the world's most popular herbicide. And the Roundup gets absorbed into the crop, which we eat. And if you look at the scientific research on Roundup, which is more extensive than the scientific research on GMOs, so we have a lot more to go on. We understand that Roundup was pronounced by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen last year. It was patented as an antibiotic. It's an endocrine disruptor. It's linked to birth defects. It's a mitochondrial toxin. It's a chelator of minerals, patented as such. And if you look at the biochemical pathways that it can disrupt, it can explain these diseases and disorders. But the biotech industry is not allowed to acknowledge even a single cough or sniffle as a result of GMOs because it's food, it's not drugs. They're not allowed to have side effects. So they do at least three things. One, they dumb down their studies to avoid finding problems. And we've caught them red-handed. I wrote 41 pages in a book all about rigged research done by Monsanto and other companies. Two, if any scientist discovers a problem, that scientist and the evidence is often distorted and denied and attacked and threatened. And this is well documented. It's written up in Nature. And I've interviewed many of those scientists, and it's not a pretty sight. Three, they suppress research in other ways. They do not allow the seeds to be used because they're patented, so they'll say no, or they require the ability to veto the release of any data. And they've also infiltrated, manipulated, or worked with regulatory agencies, scientific agencies, etc., with certain talking points. They have front groups, etc. So when they want to create a story that a particular piece of research that shows that animals fed GMOs, for example, get tumors and early death and organ damage, they come up with a sometimes completely unscientific, sometimes semi-scientific story about why that shouldn't be believed, circulate that among their front groups and representatives. They all say the same thing, and then they say there's consensus. Well, there are published papers from hundreds of scientists saying there is no consensus. And there is no consensus. But there are talking points. And some of those talking points have been backed by hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising, like the GMOs will feed the world, when the world's greatest experts at how to feed the world, commissioned by the UN and others, over 3 years, created the ISTAT report. They said the current generation of GMOs have nothing to offer to feed the hungry world, eradicate poverty. They don't even increase yields on average. So there's a lot of myths. They have $1 billion, we have $1.95, but we have now the experience of millions of people, thousands of physicians, and also more and more evidence showing that GMOs are unsafe. Thank you.
Well, I get a distinct feeling I have a biased audience. And I'm put in an uncomfortable position because I have to talk about scientific literacy and understanding how science works. And I have to call into question at the end of the day almost everything that was just said to you. But let me, and I'm just curious to start with how many people have already made up their minds about the potential dangers of GMOs. Okay, well, we won't be talking to you mainly. As I was thinking about this, I'm a simple molecular biologist, and I don't work on GMOs, and if somebody from Monsanto would like to give me a check, I'm prepared to cash it. But the reality is I've been devoted to science since I was in high school, and I believe in what it stands for. And it stands for things that are difficult to get. And I took as props, because I'm nervous, you'd think I might be less nervous because I teach all the time, but I took 3 books that I think are particularly important. One is Carl Sagan's The Demon-Haunted World, The Role of Science as a Candle in the Dark. And the danger of this kind of discussion is it's extremely easy to blow out that candle. And science is a difficult problem, and its main goal is to prove yourself wrong. Okay, that's what science is about. That's why people just spent billions of dollars to build the Large Hadron Collider, to prove that the standard model of physics is wrong. They didn't do it to prove it's right. They did it to prove it's wrong. Okay? This is what makes it hard. Science is about dismissing comfortable ideas. All right? So this is a great book if you ever are interested in reading it. A second book is from the 1800s. It's Charles Mackay's Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And this has to do with much of what we see in this audience. There is now a belief system that there's something inherently bad about GMOs, and we'll talk about what that means. But the history of the human race is full of people believing really crazy things, and it often ends up not well. So I'm reminded today, watching the news, of a secularist in Bangladesh being hacked to death for having opinions that disagreed with the Islamic fundamentalists who killed him. And this has been happening with depressing regularity. The third book is Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. This is talking about how people learn how to think and how difficult it can be to think scientifically. Because we are evolved, and we'll be talking a lot about evolution here, because we're going to talk about what the most toxic molecules are, and they're not GMOs, they're natural products. Thinking fast is what you're designed to do by evolutionary models. You run away from something that's chasing you. Science is thinking slow. It's challenging the ideas that you're bringing up. So now we have to start to go back a little bit and think about what it is that we're talking about here. We're talking about a genetically modified organism, and we're making a very strange statement. We're acting as if these are all one thing. They're not. Each one is a different plant or a different animal. It's a different species. The Bt toxin, which was discussed here, is a toxin that organic farmers spray on their crops. You understand why? Because plants are always defending themselves from being eaten by insects. That's what they do. Their leaves are full of toxins. The most toxic substances known are natural products. And you eat them all the time. And Bt toxin is a bacterial protein. The way it's made is you clone that gene out of a bacteria, you put it into a plant. If you wanted to do it as well as you could, you'd like to insert it in one place. The old generation of techniques didn't allow you to do that. You had to what's called shotgun it in. It could go into a number of places. That won't be true soon. You may have heard about CRISPR-Cas technology. It is now possible to exactly determine exactly where that gene's going to go. And you have lots of DNA that doesn't do anything. In fact, you're a GMO. Because over half of your DNA was supplied to you by viruses that infected your body and then were inactivated by your various error repair systems in your DNA. Your DNA is mutating all the time. Okay? The only reason you're not dead is because you have error repair systems. Okay? So we have to talk about, well, what is the gene you're putting in? What does it do? To lump vitamin A enriched rice with Roundup resistant corn doesn't make any sense. They're not the same plant, right? They don't do the same thing. One is a nutritional supplement for people who are getting blinded because of a lack of vitamin A in their diet. I hope you're not thinking that poor people deserve to become blind. Surely this can't be your major position. Okay. The other one is, say, BT cotton or BT corn, which you now don't have to spray anymore with pesticides because it's making its own pesticide. Now, lots of people would like to have no chemicals on their foods. That's a great idea. But that's not the way evolution works. There's no organic farmer can grow their crops without applying herbicides and pesticides because they'll be eaten. I'm more than happy to label all foods. I just like to label the cost in human labor for having poor, underpaid laborers weed crops in organic farms. This would make sense to me. I mean, you have to look at all the implications of what you're asking. So the question becomes, what is going on? What's going on? What are you changing? What are you doing? Each plant is different. Each plant should be considered separately. It is, of course, possible that a particular genetically modified organism will have net side effects. Okay? Some lunatic could recreate the smallpox virus in corn if they wanted to. It's well within the possibility of people to do with genetic engineering. We could put botulinum toxin into crops. We could do a lot of horrible, idiotic, stupid things. Each organism is distinct. It has to be evaluated. What's happened is this blanket, dare I say, knowingly ignorant vilification of GMOs has essentially driven crops that would help poor people make them commercially inviable. It's time to take responsibility for what you think you're doing. Making people not go blind is not a bad idea. Are we 1 minute? Am I done?
No, I waved 1 minute. You didn't see it.
All right, I'm done.
I'll touch you on 1 minute.
Okay, I got 3 minutes to respond. I'm not against the process of genetic engineering generically. I think someday we may be able to manipulate genes precisely and know in advance that they will make healthier food and better for the environment. My argument is that that has not arrived yet that day. I remember one scientist from UC Berkeley saying at a lecture, come back in 50 to 100 years when you've done your homework. And it turns out that in my book, Genetic Roulette, I have a 4-page list of all the fundamental assumptions that were used as a basis for safety claims for GMOs that turned out to be untrue. And yet when you release these things into the environment, they self-propagate and there's no recall. So we need to be extra careful with a technology that affects everyone who eats and can affect essentially all living beings because it affects the ecosystem and gets passed on for all future generations. It remains a permanent part of the ecosystem. Now, I'll take this time. I wanted to argue a lot of different points that were mentioned, but let's talk about the Bt toxin used by organic farmers. It turns out the reason why it's put into crops is the assumption that it will not have any effect on humans or mammals. But if you look at the toxin itself, as derived by a soil bacterium, according to the EPA's own scientific advisory panel, the published research on mice and on humans show immune reactions, and they recommended to the EPA to study that, and the EPA ignored it and allowed the Bt toxin into the crops without that extra study. That toxin is completely different than the stuff sprayed by organic farmers. It's 3,000 to 5,000 times more toxic. It's designed to be more concentrated. It's designed to be more toxic, and it's encapsulated. It doesn't wash off. It doesn't biodegrade. We get the full dose of it. And the mice and rats that are fed the Bt corn show immune responses. Now, it kills insects by poking holes in their stomachs to kill them. In 2012, in the Journal of Applied Toxicology, they showed that it pokes holes in human cells, the same type of holes it pokes in insects to kill them. And said very clearly, this shows without a doubt that Bt toxin is biologically active in mammals and humans. And they found Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada and 80% of their unborn fetuses. If it's in the blood, it may be toxic to the blood cells because it is toxic to the blood cells of white albino mice. So probably humans as well. If it gets into the unborn fetus, you have a hole-poking toxin that is an immunogen or an allergen in the circulation of an unborn fetus. These are things that should have been tested before this stuff was put on the market. Maybe Bt toxin is benign, but in all the peer-reviewed published studies that I cite, it counters this assumption that it is completely benign and does not have any interaction with human beings or with mammals. And yet we are eating it. And if in fact it does poke holes in human cells, and if it does increase an immune response, my time is up. I don't know the answer.
Well, the issue here is sort of difficult to deal with without getting too too technical. People in Pakistan are eating BT eggplant and not seeming to have any problems. And the reality is that people are studying these studies. You know, there's a growing consensus. I was going to talk about this originally before I was stopped from talking for an hour and a half, and because I am a college professor and that's my ground state. It is very common in the scientific literature for dramatic positive results to be reported and never reproduced. And this is what happens all the time because there's essentially bias against publishing negative results. And the reality is that no biotech company in their right mind would sell something that would actually knowingly cause these kinds of damage, because the lawsuits would be amazing. But the reality is there's no evidence for harm. But let's keep in mind that it always depends on the dose. I mean, I'm a cell biologist, I study membranes. Your membranes are making holes in them all the time that heal. There's a reason that BT kills a certain kind of insect and not mammals. Okay, so we could go into the cell biology of that toxicology. Essentially, it's benign in humans. That's the way it is, right? And I'm, sorry about that. But the issue are, everything has a dose response. Think about any drug. I was looking at this because I know this kind of argument, and think about the original smallpox vaccine. It caused cardiomyopathy in about 1 in 200 people. How many people have had smallpox in this audience? Or polio? Or no, just had the disease. Now, if you're going to wait until you, and remember, there is no drug, because of the way molecules work, there is no drug that's free of side effects except the homeopathic medicines sold at Whole Foods, because they don't do anything. Okay? So if you watch, how many people have ever watched TV and seen a drug ad on television? How many people have ran out of the room thinking about the possible side effects of the drug they're taking for whatever they're taking? Okay? Everything we're talking about is a cost-benefit analysis. It's a cost-benefit analysis for the company. It's a cost-benefit analysis for the person. It's a cost-benefit analysis for the farmer. There is no free lunch in this world. Everything has a danger, right? The FDA regulates these drugs and these things to identify things that are particularly bad, and they're removed. I'll just say one more thing. The idea of these crops being self-propagating, can I just finish one? Is almost all of these crops are agriculturally derived. They've been inbred for a long time. They're not viable without people taking care of them, right? Corn does not grow on the side of the road unless it's planted by farmers. Okay? They're aberrations because of the way they've been bred. They're not competitive. So it's a minimalist issue. But in the new world, even these issues will be resolved, I think, by using more accurate technologies. But the final thing is just, it's a cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost? What's the benefit? If you like people having polio, you won't have a polio vaccine that has side effects. And now there isn't one because we developed a new one.
Can I raise a point now in response for 3 minutes? Okay. Sure. You said no company in their right mind would introduce a product that they know would harm people, and yet Monsanto got fined $700 million for their actually hurting the people in Anniston, Alabama, knowingly, and the leaked documents verified it, and the response was, we can't afford to lose $1 of business. Well, I talked to a former Monsanto scientist. He said 3 of his colleagues did safety studies on bovine growth hormone and found so much cancer-promoting hormone in the milk, the 3 scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. Now, bovine growth hormone is a genetically engineered drug from Monsanto, and the FDA actually wrote an article defending its approval, saying that we don't have to worry about extra bovine growth hormone in the milk because it's 90% is destroyed during pasteurization. If you look at the actual study, they pasteurized the milk 120 times longer than normal, but they only destroyed 19%. So they spiked the milk with 147 times the amount of natural occurring bovine growth hormone, heated it 120 times longer than normal, and under those rigged conditions, it destroyed 90% of the hormone. And it was a rigged research. I talked to someone at the FDA who was fired because he was calling for more research on RBGH. He fought, and the courts agreed, and they told him in the court trial he was being set up because he was slowing down the approval process. The person who was the chief reviewer was Monsanto's former hiree, a PhD, working on bovine growth hormone, and someone who used to work at Monsanto who did the research on bovine growth hormone became the director of the division that reviewed her own research. Now, we can look at how they rigged their research. What I'm hearing from you, Mike, is what science should be, and I agree. But there's a difference between science and corporate science or political science. You may not know this. We're not allowed to applaud. You may not know this, but when they're doing animal feeding studies, they compare feeding animals GMOs with a control that's also eating GMOs and Roundup in the conventional commercial chow. And when they find that they're still having statistically significant effects, they bring in another control. They look in the literature for some control group that got sicker than their experimental group and say, well, it's compared to that historic control, there was no statistical significance. Well, that historical control may have been fed feed that was contaminated with lead or mercury or DDT, or there were some conditions affecting the entire situation. This is not science. This is not the control thing. You talk about actual science. Where do I get my information? From scientists, from genetic engineers, from some of the best empirical biological scientists in the world. And when they actually read the research done by the industry, they say it's like pulling their hair out, because this is not how science is done. This is corporate science. They use the wrong detection methods, the wrong control groups, the wrong statistics. They have bad science down to a science. And we can show very, very specifically where their unscientific information lies.
All right, so I have to respond, and I like anecdotes as much as the next person, but I'm a professional scientist, and I don't believe any of them. I only believe what's published. I only believe what's reproducible. I only believe what can be established by others. And this is the standard methodology. I know this person who says this thing. I'm reminded, a friend of mine who does in vitro fertilization was reminded about when Jim Watson said that all in vitro fertilization should be banned because it was going to generate huge numbers of monsters. 5 million babies, healthy babies later, it's helping lots of people in many, many contexts. You cannot argue based on anecdote. You have to argue based on what is the current scientific consensus. And I'm not an expert on agricultural products, and I'll say you can't act as if all GMOs are the same thing. Each one is different. But the current consensus is there is no significant health risk from these crops. And it's being tested everywhere. There are tens of thousands of farmers spraying Roundup on their crops. You don't see a gigantic increase in these diseases. It's not published. It's not available to read because it's not there. And remember, even the pesticides that are being used, even the oil from citrus that's used as a pesticide turns out to also be a carcinogen. Carcinogens are everywhere. There's a great study in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy by Bruce Ames some time ago, where he estimated that 99.9% of the pesticides you eat are natural products because they're in the leaves you eat. You know, kale does not want to be been taken advantage of by some caterpillar. Okay? It's trying to poison it. The more you know about the evolutionary, basically, battle between plants and their predators, the more you realize that the most toxic molecules known are plant substances. They're designed to kill animals. They're designed to kill insects. That's what they do. That's how they survive. So back to where I'm coming from. We can only rely on published, reproducible studies. Often there's a single paper published, it's cited, and the fact that it's never been reproduced is ignored. Cold fusion, I mean, how many are you now, and so I have 2 points. How many people are you now driving cold fusion cars? You are, well, I want to talk to you because it turns out I have no illusions about the morality of big business. I drive a Volkswagen clean diesel, okay? And I am fully prepared to believe that people will cheat and they'll pay.
I think I just got you, Mike. I think I just got you. I think you played right into my hands. You said, first of all, this stuff needs to be published. Everything I said was based on published. The research, the charts showing the increase in diseases correlated to glyphosate, there's more than 30 of them published. The historical controls, how they use false controls from other groups, that's actually part of Monsanto's own research. You can look at it, Pathways to Modern Disease 4 about cancer, and this was done because the person used a FOIA request to get Monsanto's sealed documents about Roundup and showed that they explained away all of these cancers and tumors by looking at historical controls. They looked at 11 different studies that weren't their own tightly controlled study, but someone else to see if they could figure out how to explain away statistical significance. This is very, very specifically published, but if you look at Monsanto's research, usually they don't publish it. Usually they submit it to the FDA and it doesn't require to be published, and sometimes it gets leaked or pulled out from FOIA requests, and actual scientists look at it and say, this would never pass my graduate students. The one that was published in 1996, Journal of Nutrition, it became the subject of another peer-reviewed study showing how the research was designed to avoid finding problems. And then, I can even describe it, it's so brilliant how they do it, how they mix and match controls to create increased statistical noise so that significance disappears. And when they planted something side by side in the same environment, in the same climate, which they're supposed to do, they left that information out. That was the only real compositional study, and someone found it in the journal archives and published it in a letter to the editor because it wasn't published in the Journal of Nutrition. And it turns out Monsanto found and ignored the fact that GM soy had as much as a 7-fold increase in a known soy allergen called trypsin inhibitor. An allergen 7 times higher in Monsanto's soy. Why didn't they publish that? Because the title of the study was GM soy and non-GM soy are substantially equivalent. If they had published their real data, it would have been shot down. And that was the study upon which GMOs were considered safe. And they used too much protein, and they used too little GMO samples, and they overcooked samples, and it was absolutely brilliantly designed. And they paid the journal to publish it. So I think I work with scientists. I work with scientists all over the world. And we know that if we're going against corporations who use corporate science, we have to be squeaky clean. And so they have very, very specific from the peer-reviewed studies, and it is reproducible. If you look at a study, just Google it. 19 GMO studies show signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys. 19 times. And then the most recent one, they did a profile. They looked. You'll have to wait till next time to find out what happened.
It's very hard to argue this because this is my fear of he said, she said, they said, somebody else said. I can only rely on the latest meta-analyses and other studies that fail to find danger in these plants. There's very little else one can say. I feel like it's very much like dealing with a flat earth person, and when I was younger and more naive, I used to debate periodically creationists, and I stopped doing that, basically because there's always 3 studies that prove the point. And the reality is all of modern science would collapse if most creationists' points of view were held to be true, because physics wouldn't work, geology wouldn't work, astrophysics wouldn't work. we are trying to come to a consensus. I want to make it clear, I don't believe that you can eat any plant without a danger of getting sick. There's no healthy plant. All plants are full of chemicals that can do all kinds of stuff. There are phytoestrogens in soy. There are toxins everywhere. The question is whether when you have a normal diet, you run any increased risk of getting cancer or other diseases. The consensus is no. And the problem is, it's easy to blame Monsanto because you see them, but there's a whole natural food industry who's worked extremely hard to keep herbal supplements from being regulated. There are many stories of herbal supplements and various kinds of alternative medicines that are either not what they say they are, or toxic, or don't do what they're supposed to do. And this has been a cause of major lobbying to keep these products from being regulated. And so remember, everybody, I mean, the people at Whole Foods turn out to be trying to make money too. They're not, and so I can't engage back and forth as I have better scientists than you do. My guys, are more rigorous than you do. The problem is, what we end up with is a consensus. What is the current conclusion? I can assure you that if it were true that these crops cause a major disease, it would be front page news in every major newspaper, and there would be lawsuits. And you don't have to believe me, because there is an underlying myth here that natural is good and unnatural is not good.
Can I interject?
Go ahead.
Kind of based on what you just said, Michael, I was wondering if you guys could both speak back to the topic at hand, which is what is the role of science in public and private decisions or personal decisions? Because there is obviously dissension within the community. There is a consensus. There are studies that say it's not true, but at some point, and divide those up, the public and the personal, because what should the role of making public decisions about GMOs, how should science factor into that? Who should politicians listen to? Who should people listen to when it comes time to make this?
Can I do that first?
Please.
Okay. So let me take my position. It is my belief that there are people who stand to gain by labeling a diverse set of plants and animals as being unnatural and toxic. How many people take insulin or know somebody who takes insulin? It's almost all made by GMO bacteria. Okay. The pernicious side effect of this conscious labeling of everything in one basket has been to drive products that are of direct benefit to a wide range of people off the market. They just simply are not, they're not viable because they can't be sold in Europe, or they can't be sold here, or they can't be sold there. This is essentially organic imperialism, if you like the term. Okay? Why people who don't, in China and India, why children who don't get enough vitamin A in their diet are condemned by people in Boulder, Colorado, or Munich, Germany, to not have access to those foods is beyond me. It's arrogant. It's unjustified. It's even herbicides. I don't know how many of your children look forward to a career weeding plants. Back-breaking work paid below minimum wage. Every organic product that uses cheap labor should be labeled as such. And you can go to Whole Foods and feel like you're happy to be one of the oppressors. It's fine by me, as long as you state what you're actually for. If you want to be reasonable, you will realize that every GMO crop, every genetically engineered organism is distinct. It has its own benefits, it has its own side effects. They can be studied or not. You can sue Volkswagen. I plan to sue Volkswagen later this week. But remember what you're doing. Back off from a sanctimonious position that's hurting a lot of people. That's my position. And that's all I can say.
Thank you. I want to tell a story of Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading scientist in his field. He worked at the top nutritional research laboratory in Europe, and he was given $3 million to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs by the UK government. And he had submitted in advance the particular protocols that he was going to use for testing, and he was a pro-GMO scientist, and he had people working at 3 different institutes, over 30 people. And he fed, as part of his protocols to test them, he fed one group of rats potatoes that were genetically engineered to produce an insecticide. Another group was non-GMO potatoes of the same type. A third, non-GMO potatoes, but they spiked the meal with the same amount of insecticide that the GMO potatoes were producing. So you have GMO potatoes, non-GMO, and non-GMO plus insecticide. Only the group that was eating the GMO potatoes got sick. Potentially precancerous cell growth, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system within 10 days. If you look at the study design, you realize it wasn't the particular gene product. It wasn't the insecticide that caused the problem. In fact, he had fed that same insecticide 700 times that amount to rats and didn't see those things. It was somehow the generic process of genetic engineering, and he realized it was the same process used to create the crops that were currently on the market. And I can explain why that's the case. Generically, a primitive technology causing massive collateral damage. And I interviewed him, and what happened was he was invited to speak on television, and with permission from his director, he spoke, and it was broadcast for 2.5 minutes, and then it was big news because he was a leading scientist saying GMOs are not safe, and then his director took all the calls and was calling this fantastic science, world-changing, and then 2 calls came from the UK Prime Minister's office to the director. The next day, Dr. Pusztai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. The team was disbanded, the data was withdrawn, and there was a concerted effort to destroy his reputation. 7 months and 1 heart attack later, his gag order was lifted by an order of Parliament. His data came back, and it's published in The Lancet. And it shows that the process of genetic engineering is implicated as being unsafe. And I asked him, what was the most shocking moment? Because I wanted to start a book about it. And it was actually months earlier, when he had a chance to read the confidential submissions by the biotech industry that got their crops approved in Europe. You see, he had been figuring out how to test for the safety of GMOs, so he was one of the most qualified people on earth to evaluate these studies. And he was pro-GMO. And he said when he read those studies, it was a turning point in his life, the most shocking moment, because he realized what he was doing and what the companies were doing was diametrically opposed. He said what I was doing was safety studies. What they were doing was as little as possible to get their foods on the market as quickly as possible, and it would not, may I finish the point, please, Mike? Mm-hmm. May I finish? And it would not, those superficial studies would not have evaluated and caught any of the problems that he found with his potatoes and rats. And so he realized, he said to me, you know really poor science and bad science, and this was poor, superficial, just absolutely designed wrong. And yet that was the research that allowed crops to get approved. And so it's people like him who are the greatest in their field that are my mentors. And so I disagree. Well, I'll pick it up from there.
Yeah, I want to jump in because I know a lot of scientists, and I don't know how you decide whether somebody's the greatest person in the world. I've known some really stupid Nobel laureates, and the reality is that that's not a scientific argument. That's an argument from authority. You know what's nice about scientists, actually, when they're allowed to do what they do, is they hate authority. They never believe anybody when they're telling me, I'm the expert on this and I'm telling you how it works. Prove it. Okay? The history of science is littered with inaccurate claims made by very smart people who turn out to, I mean, Newton spent a lot of time trying to turn lead into gold, just so you know. It didn't work. He's easily he's probably smarter than this fellow who was doing the potato study. It's possible, I don't know, I didn't meet him. But the reality is it's irrelevant what somebody's status is. This is not an argument from personal authority, it's an argument from data. Now, I don't believe that if this is what we're going to keep doing, it's not worth arguing or talking about or even discussing, because it has nothing to do with the way science works. Science works by somebody proving it. Now, an interesting question would be if somebody says, oh, the general process of, I genetically modify frogs on a regular basis, and that process does not create all kinds of mutations. It creates the mutation we're trying to make. That's what you're trying to do. And in fact, if you want, you can cross out all the other mutations by doing genetics. So the question would become, when are the anti-GMO people going to try to prove that they're wrong, which is what a scientist would try to do. Okay? So you want to play at being a scientist, then get your ass into the lab and prove it. That's why it's hard. Okay? That's why it takes a long time. That's why people publish one result, then they revise it a different way, then they do another one, because we build on what we know. We discover what's good. To say that making a genetically modified organism creates some amorphous aberration is bullshit. Okay? To use a technical term, if you want, there's a great book on bullshit by Frankfurter, and the reality is, there comes a time when it's talking about what you can prove. What's the mechanism? How does it work? It's now possible to map every genetic mutation in an organism. You can prove it. It costs a little money, but you can prove it. It's cheaper than it used to be. We can sequence stuff for less than $10,000. So, that's the standard that scientists are working at. That's why it's hard. That's why it's easier to claim, I know somebody who says this thing.
Which I'm going to interject again because
Thank you.
they never answered my question. Do you guys notice that?
Well, we like you.
Thank you.
We like you.
So, what this brings to mind is, how does someone who is, say, a politician that does not have a background, they haven't been doing this for 20 years, they haven't been being a researcher, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. What do they do when they're told, well, there's an 80% consensus that GMOs are safe, and then there are all these things that you've talked about that, well, this found that isn't true, and there's a skepticism of corporate research. How do you make your mind up how do you proceed? What do you do if you can take yourself out of your position and make yourself that politician? Who do you listen to? The skeptical study, or the 22 that seem to go a different way? And then if you'll do that for briefly and then back and forth, I'd still like to know how we do that.
Well, it's hard to convince an attention deficit politician. And I wrote a book for that, with the left side, the summary, and the details on the right, so they can just look at the left side. But it's a question, and I agree with you, Mike, that this is not about my story and my scientist and his credentials. But it's not a story about consensus. And you can't just say there is a consensus and make it so, because there are hundreds of scientists who disagree with you completely, and they are real scientists. David Schubert of the Salk Institute wrote about how golden rice is probably the most dangerous type of GMO and should never be introduced. He's one of the tops. He's a very senior researcher, but he has the data in there. So how do you decide whether you're a politician or anyone else? You see, what you don't realize, Mike, is that we actually have the data. We have the data published in peer-reviewed studies. I compiled everything that was available by 2007 in one book. There's a lot more available now. We have the data. The question is, how do you choose between the data that shows there's problems and the data that shows there's not problems? Then you have to look at the design. Then you take a look, is this tobacco science? Is this corporate science, or is it real? So when I point out, for example, how they use the wrong control group, A perfect example. One study showed there's 12 to 15% less phytoestrogens in soy. Those are supposed to be good. Monsanto rushed to publication their study, which said there's too much variability, so we can't even do a statistical analysis. They used the same lab. But when Monsanto gave it to them, they instructed them, don't use the modern research detection methods. Use the old one that's prone to variability. If you don't know that, you can say, oh, well, Monsanto's data shows that it's different. But Monsanto's data is cooked books. And so I spent 20 years interviewing scientists about data. And I can tell you, I agree with everything you say about the context of science. What I'm inserting is the data. What I'm inserting is a careful analysis of how the industry will do a compilation, a meta-analysis, and leave out all the research which shows that there's problems, claiming that they're doing a full meta-analysis, and include all this industrial research that has nothing to do with safety studies. It has to do with the size of the fat pad of the chicken. They're called industrial studies. They're not academic safety studies. There's very few of them, and almost all of them show problems. So we're arguing, actually, this whole concept that somehow I'm not scientific. What do? I interview scientists. I write what I think they said. I show it to them. They approve it. I show it to another scientist to make sure that there's general consensus among the people I'm talking to, and then I put it out there, and I respond to these things. So my concept is, it is difficult for a politician to make the decision because they don't have the time, which is why I wrote the book, Genetic Roulette, and I wrote it so you can scan it quickly or do a casual read or an in-depth study, and it has made a difference.
So how would you tell politicians to make a decision?
Well, this is a difficult question, in the sense that, in general, you're always looking for a consensus. Now that we have an argument here about whether there's a consensus about GMOs. If I go to the FDA website or I go to the Center for Disease Control website, I find that they're saying there's a consensus. That's what it says. Whether you can find and this is of course the problem. We live in a world not long ago when people thought crystals were going to help you do things, and people who there are plenty of studies published in England about how great homeopathic medicines can be, and the issue becomes getting down to the scientific rigor. If GMOs, just talking about GMOs as a group, is already distortion, but then the question becomes, well, what's the mechanism of how they're acting? How are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? These are studies that are done with lots of molecules all the time. I've never seen one for how these molecules cause the diseases they're supposed to cause. I was looking up for fun one of the organic molecules that's approved for organic farms that's a carcinogen, limonene, and it's actually turns out to cause testicular cancer in rats, and it's in many of your, if you use air fresheners, it's evaporated and reacts and forms formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen. The question becomes, what's the mechanism? How do I build a compelling argument? For example, in climate change, you have data. You can look at the carbon dioxide levels in the air. You can look at data. You're waiting for this consensus to emerge. We can argue back and forth. I don't believe that the personal testimony of scientists taken by a person with an obvious, I would say, just the use of the word GMO to talk about all these organisms together strikes me as evidence of prejudice, because they're not all the same thing. Now, if I'm going to take the word of somebody at the Salk that vitamin A enriched rice is bad for you, I have to go look at it, and then there should be studies about it if that's true. I don't even know if this person is an expert. He's at the Salk, which does biomedical research. Doesn't do agricultural research as far as I know. So the question becomes, this is exactly the problem that I think Joel's talking about. I can throw out authorities here and there and here and there, and this happens in climate change, it happens in vaccination, it happens in GMOs, and what's a person to think? It's very hard. There are books all over the place about basically making claims that aren't true. The question becomes, how much time do you have to go in and look? It's a big problem. It is a big problem. Okay? It's not trivia, partly because there are competing interests that have real conflicting goals, and they're not easily resolved. Feeding poor people is an important goal. Avoiding toxic responses is another important goal. I'm done.
Not only is it time for Michael, it's actually, believe it or not, that was a fast hour, wasn't it? Now you can applaud because that was really good.
Thank you.
I have no idea what we're supposed to do.
We're done.
I know that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.